In 1992, Murray Rothbard, the famed libertarian economist, took the podium at the John Randolph Club, an exclusive gathering of right-wing activists in suburban Virginia. The title of the event was, "Can the Republic Be Saved?" And Murray, as president of the club, gave a lengthy address passionately proclaiming the philosophy and aims of the club. He spent much of the speech denouncing the existing conservative establishment. Rothbard singled out in particular the eminent William F. Buckley, the most prominent and influential conservative intellectual in the country. As the founder of the National Review, Buckley was the intellectual face of American conservatism, and from 1966 to 1999 hosted the public affairs show Firing Line, featuring interviews and debates with innumerable public figures in American life. He represented the moderate, elite Northeastern brand of Republican politics, which was dominant within the GOP at this time, a brand which Rothbard was vociferously contemptuous of. And so, with almost blitzkrieg swiftness, by the early 1960s, the new global crusading conservative movement, transformed and headed by Bill Buckley, was almost ready to take power in America. But not quite, because first, all the various heretics of the right, all the groups that were in any way radical or could deprive the new conservative movement of its much desired respectability in the eyes of the liberal and centrist elite, all these had to be jettisoned. Only such a denatured, respectable, non-radical conserving right was worthy of power. One after another, Buckley and the National Review purged and excommunicated all the radicals, all the non-respectables, isolationists, anti-Zionists, libertarians, Ayn Randians, the John Birch Society, and all those who continued, like the early National Review, to dare to oppose Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Revolution, after Buckley had changed and decided to embrace it. For the neocons have managed to establish the notion that anyone who might be to the right of them is by definition a representative of the forces of darkness, of chaos, old night, racism, and anti-Semitism. The heartland is with us, and the heartland, bless them, knows little and cares less about which variety of a social democrat happens to be gaining or losing power inside the Beltway. Yes, the status-anxious, paranoid, deeply resentful radical right is back, and this time we're not going to succumb to the smears and the excommunications. With the inspiration of the death of the Soviet Union before us, we now know that it can be done. With Pat Buchanan as our leader, we shall break the clock of social democracy. We shall break the clock of the Great Society. We shall break the clock of the welfare state. We shall break the clock of the New Deal. We shall break the clock of Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom and Perpetual War. We shall repeal the 20th century. The room erupted. As one witness put it, prior to Murray's speech, it had been a pleasant, almost scholarly atmosphere. Murray's speech changed the tone. At the conclusion, the crowd leapt to their feet, cheering wildly, ready to storm the Capitol. I have never seen anything like it. Some even had tears in their eyes. Murray had eloquently and passionately stated the aspirations of the emerging radical right, which at the beginning of the 1990s was slowly starting to crawl out of the shadows. Murray's call to repeal the 20th century summarized the essence of the agenda, a radical turning of the clock back to before the Civil Rights Movement, to before the New Deal, to before all the dramatic changes and reforms of the 20th century designed to make America more equal and democratic. And in his speech, Rothbard sang the praises of Pat Buchanan, a television commentator and former communications director for Ronald Reagan, who had emerged as a political figurehead for the radical right, and a bridgehead into the political mainstream. Buchanan had launched a presidential campaign, entering the Republican primaries against President George H.W. Bush as the representative for the far-right element of the Republican Party. Buchanan lost, garnering only 23% of the primary vote and winning no states. But Bush's campaign was sufficiently concerned about keeping Buchanan's supporters in the tent that he was offered a speaking slot at the Republican National Convention. There, Buchanan delivered a speech which today seems rather tame, but back then it was quite controversial. He presented a dark vision of a country splintering into two camps, one representing the old, traditional America, and the other representing a radical assault on the country's traditions and customs, which had to be forcefully defeated.
Friends, this election is about more than who gets what. It is about who we are. It is about what we believe and what we stand for as Americans. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America.
Today, the 1990s in America are remembered as a decade of relative prosperity and peace. But that wasn't true for much of the first half of the decade. The early 1990s were a time of economic recession and instability, with a sharp recession from 1990 to 1991, followed by a slow, sluggish recovery. Dissatisfaction with and pessimism about the state of the country surged. In 1999, 71% of Americans said they were satisfied with the direction of the country. But 7 years earlier, in 1992, that percentage was just 14%. The country was experiencing an economic and social crisis. The post-war economic boom, viewed widely as the golden age of American capitalism, had ended 20 years earlier. And still, the country had not seemed to have found a new economic model to revitalize prosperity. High-paying manufacturing jobs, which were the bedrock of working-class prosperity, were disappearing. The old manufacturing giants are suffering from low profitability and indebtedness. Small businessmen and farmers were crushed by the fall in prices and struggled to pay off their debts. Crime rates were reaching a peak, and 1992 saw the Los Angeles riots, one of the worst civil disturbances in American history, with 63 deaths and $1 billion in damages. Dissatisfaction with the two mainstream parties propelled the third-party bid of Texas magnate Ross Perot, running on an ill-defined, vaguely populist platform. And it was at this moment that the American far right, long consigned to the absolute fringes of politics since the 1930s, began to make headway into the political mainstream again. The emerging radical faction of the GOP, represented by Pat Buchanan, called themselves the Paleo-Conservative Movement. They were part of a broader right-wing movement known as the New Right, calling for a new radical, populist, and disruptive right-wing politics which tolerated no compromises with liberals and the left, which called for severely restricting immigration and turning back toward economic nationalism and protectionism, which called for winning the culture war and defending traditional hierarchies from the advances of progressive ideology. When speaking to a broader audience, paleo-conservatives like Buchanan would omit or soften the most radical aspirations of the movement, only winking and nodding and dog-whistling. But in more private quarters, like at the John Randolph Club, they were much more open about their profoundly radical desires. Their radicalism can be demonstrated by the fact that Pat Buchanan was not the only far-right politician who Rothbard sang the praises of. Shortly before his speech at the John Randolph Club, Murray published an essay titled Right-Wing Populism, A Strategy for the Paleo Movement. He began the essay by applauding the runner-up in the 1991 Louisiana governor's race, none other than David Duke, the neo-Nazi and former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, who shocked the American establishment with his unexpectedly strong electoral performance. In the midst of a severe economic crisis in Louisiana, Duke rose to prominence and scored second place in the first round of voting for the governor's race. Ultimately, Duke lost the runoff by a large margin, but still attained 38% of the vote and a majority, 55%, of the white vote. Rothbard described these events with glee. Well, they finally got David Duke, but he sure scared the bejesus out of them. It took a massive campaign of hysteria, of fear and hate, orchestrated by all wings of the ruling elite, from official right to left, from President Bush and the official Republican Party, through the New York-Washington-run national media, through the local elites, and down to local left-wing activists. But even so, David Duke picked up a 55% of the white vote. He lost in the runoff because the fear campaign brought out a massive outpouring of black voters. But note the excitement. Politics in Louisiana rose from the usual torpor that we have been used to for decades, and brought out a turnout rate at 80% that hasn't been seen since the 19th century, when party politics was fiercely partisan and ideological. Rothbard argued that the paleo movement needed to follow in Duke's footsteps, and push an aggressive right-wing populism. This right-wing populism would combat, as he put it, the unholy alliance of corporate liberal, big business, and media elites who, through big government, have privileged and caused to rise up a parasitic underclass, who, among them all, are looting and oppressing the bulk of the middle and working classes in America. Therefore, the proper strategy of libertarians and paleos is a strategy of a right-wing populism, that is, to expose and denounce this unholy alliance, and to call for getting this preppy underclass liberal media alliance off the backs of the rest of us, the middle and working classes. Rothbard laid out the agenda for this right-wing populism. Slash taxes. All taxes, sales, business, property, etc., but especially the most oppressive politically and personally, the income tax. Slash welfare. Get rid of underclass rule by abolishing the welfare system, or short of abolition, severely cutting and restricting it. Abolish affirmative action, set aside racial quotas, etc., and point out that the root of such quotas is the entire civil rights structure, which tramples on the property rights of every American. Take back the streets, crush criminals, and by this I mean, of course, not white-collar criminals or inside traders, but violent street criminals. Cops must be unleashed. Abolish the Fed, attack the banksters. The Fed is an organized cartel of banksters, who are creating inflation, ripping off the public, destroying the savings of the average American. America first. The American economy is not only in recession, it is stagnating. The average family is worse off now than it was 2 decades ago. Come home, America. Stop supporting bums abroad. Stop all foreign aid, which is aid to banksters and their bonds and their export industries. Stop globe baloney, and let's solve our problems at home. Defend family values, which means get the state out of the family, and replace state control by parental control. In the long run, this means ending public schools, and replacing them by private schools. Rothbard believed that these goals could be achieved through right-wing populism, to appeal to those Americans whom he described as squeezed between big business and big government above them, and the parasitic underclass below them. But who were these Americans he had in mind? Who were these Americans who Buchanan sought to appeal to when running for president? In 1919, in the aftermath of World War I, a meager German locksmith named Anton Drexler founded what he called the German Workers' Party, which would later be renamed to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Drexler was a far-right radical incensed by the German Revolution, which overthrew the Kaiser's monarchy and ushered in the liberal democratic Weimar Republic. And he joined the extreme right-wing scene in Munich in the aftermath of the violent overthrow of the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic, a failed communist revolt ruthlessly crushed by the proto-fascist Freikorps. Like many on the political right enraged and shocked by the defeat in the war and the sudden overthrow of the German monarchy, Drexler believed that a new radical, aggressive, populist right-wing politics aimed at overthrowing the new Weimar Republic could restore Germany's glory. And Drexler believed, like Rothbard 70 years later, that this new radical right-wing populism would find its appeal among the middle and working classes. As Richard Evans wrote in his trilogy on the Third Reich, this was the German Workers' Party, founded on January 5th, 1919 by one Anton Drexler, a locksmith who had previously belonged to the Fatherland Party. Drexler insisted that he was a socialist and a worker, opposed to unearned capital, exploitation, and profiteering. But this was socialism with a nationalistic twist. Drexler ascribed the evils he fought to the Jews. He directed his appeal not to industrial workers, but to the productive estates, to all those who lived from honest labor. In the short run, this meant the lower middle classes. But equally, Drexler's party sought in the longer term to win the working class over from Marxism and enlist it in the service of the pan-German cause. Drexler's party would become the Nazi Party led by Adolf Hitler, ascending to prominence and power through an extreme right-wing populism targeted at the middle and working classes. But although the Nazis invested heavy effort into winning over the working class, they found their appeal to workers was limited, with working class voters remaining largely loyal to either the Social Democrats or Communists. But among the middle classes, the Nazis found a widespread and enthusiastic support. In the elections from 1930 to 1932, the Nazis attained enormous support among farmers, shopkeepers, artisans, the self-employed, the struggling lower middle classes who turned to radical politics amidst the devastation of the Great Depression, segments of society which viewed themselves as crushed between a ruling corporate and financial elite, often classed as Jewish, above them, and the working class and the poor beneath them, whom they despised and from whom they feared communist revolution. This was the core base of the Nazi movement. Those who were most drawn to extreme right-wing populism and its promises of national rejuvenation and purification, and the radical defense of traditional society against the onslaught of liberalism, Marxism, and progressive and humanistic ideas. Far-right politics in Germany had long held a particular appeal to these groups who composed what Marxists have often called the petite or petty bourgeoisie. These were people who were neither wealthy capitalists, owning the factories and mills which powered industrialization, nor the workers, who sold their labor to the capitalist class and worked in the factories and mills of the industrial age. They were located somewhere in between. They were independent small businessmen and farmers and artisans who saw themselves as superior to the lowly working class and poor, and they were always deeply fearful of sinking to their level. At the same time, they retained suspicion and resentment toward the big capitalists, the wealthy high bourgeoisie who monopolized the wealth and power, and the bankers and moneylenders who provided credit and charged interest. And whenever members of the petty bourgeoisie fell into economic duress and insecurity, they found radical right-wing populism highly attractive. Decades earlier, in 1873, the German writer Wilhelm Marr published The Victory of Jewdom over Germandom, viewed from a non-confessional standpoint, the first work to espouse racial anti-Semitism, distinct from the religiously based anti-Semitism of old. Marr insisted that Jews and Germans were different races, and professed conspiratorial ideas about Jews and their oppression of small businessmen and artisans. He later coined the term anti-Semitism, and in 1879 founded the League of Anti-Semites. Marr was a failed businessman who suffered from persistent financial difficulties, and went through 3 marriages. His second wife was Jewish and financially supported him until she died in 1874, and his third wife was half Jewish, and he resented her deeply because he had to pay her child support. And this kind of background wasn't unusual for right-wing radicals in Germany drawn to anti-Semitism. This was a politics which appealed most to men like Marr, the struggling and precarious lower middle class who saw a solution to their woes and grievances in far-right politics. They would be the core base of the Nazis 6 decades later. Fast forward to 1994, a book entitled The Beautiful Losers, Essays on the Failure of American Conservatism was published. It was a collection of essays by Samuel Francis, an editor for the Washington Times, who would later be dismissed in 1995 for being extremely racist when speaking at a conference for American Renaissance, a white supremacist magazine. Throughout the essays, Francis described the dramatic evolution of American society from the laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century to what he called the managerial regime which emerged in the 20th century, with American society coming under the sway of a sprawling, powerful state which interfered in economic and social affairs to promote egalitarian and progressive goals, and megacorporations which centralized and rationalized the economy, squeezing out the propertied middle classes. The ideology of the emerging managerial regime in the United States came to be known as progressivism, and later as liberalism, though a more appropriate label might be managerial humanism. The ideology articulated a view of man as the product of social and economic environment, and thus susceptible to amelioration or perfection by a scientifically trained elite with power to redesign the environment. It rejected or regarded as backward, repressive, or obsolete the institutions and values of traditional and bourgeois society, its loyalties to the local community, traditional religion, and moral beliefs, the family, and social and political differentiations based on class, status, and property. And it expressed an ideal of man liberated from such constraints, and re-educated or redesigned into a cosmopolitan participant in the mass state economy of the managerial system. Yet the managerial regime did not evolve, nor its elites become dominant in the economy, government, and mass society without a struggle. From the early 20th century to the present, the social and political forces that resisted the formation of the managerial regime and the implementation of its agenda constituted a conservative, at times reactionary, influence. Small businessmen and entrepreneurs, the more parochial sectors of American society, lower middle class elements, and groups that found the physical burden and social effects of the new regime a threat to their economic status and cultural identity, provided the political base of the conservative resistance to managerial forces and ideas. The members of this base saw in the fusion of state and economy a threat to their own independent standing, endangered by the labor unions, regulations, and intervention imposed by the new managerial state in partnership with the mass corporations. They saw their own values and institutions denigrated and undermined by the cosmopolitan ethic and egalitarian policies of the new elite. They suffered from the inflation and exorbitant taxation that financed the managerial state and from the crime and social dislocation that resulted from its social policies, by which the managerial regime subsidized an urban proletariat as its own political base. They were offended and often frightened by the globalist and, in their view, un-American international policies of the elite, which involved a permanent intervention in world affairs, expensive foreign aid programs, the prospect of global war, and the renunciation of national interests in return for a cosmopolitan one world that they regarded as both illusory and dangerous. Francis identified these middle-class groups which resisted the coming of the managerial regime as the natural base of the radical right in America. In a later essay, Francis gave these groups a name, the MARS, or Middle American Radicals. The Middle American Radicals were lower middle-class elements of American society, small businessmen and skilled and semi-skilled but non-intellectual workers, who, according to Francis, are a distinct group partly because of their view of government as favoring both the rich and the poor simultaneously. Mars are distinct in the depth of their feeling that the middle class has been seriously neglected. If there is one single summation of the Mar perspective, it is reflected in a statement which was read to respondents: "The rich give in to the demands of the poor, and the middle-income people have to pay the bill." For Francis, these Middle American radicals were the heart and soul of the country. They are the Americans denounced as the racist, sexist, anti-Semites, xenophobes, homophobes, and hate criminals who haunt the dark corners of the land, the dark side of America, even as their own energy, sacrifice, and commitment make possible the regime and the elite that despise them, exploit them, and dispossess them. They are at once the real victims of the regime and the core or nucleus of American civilization, the real America, the American nation. Throughout this century, Middle Americans have gradually acquired a collective consciousness, an awareness of who they are and what their position is in the regime that exploits them. In economically prosperous periods, the radicalism of that consciousness is largely dormant. But in the Depression, the inflationary crunch of the 1970s, and the recessions of the early 1980s and early 1990s, material insecurity has served as a trigger for a heightened consciousness, a radicalization, a sharper self-perception of their plight. The left offers nothing but economic redistribution predicated on egalitarian and universalist dogmas. And in practice, this means that liberal left policies reflect the interests of the non-white underclass and the intelligentsia that designs the formulas and policies of the left. Hence, the left is incapable of defending the specific interests and concrete cultural norms of Middle Americans. The appropriate formula for the expression of Middle American material interests and cultural values is nationalism. A nationalism that is politically and culturally based on Middle Americans, expresses their material interests, and affirms their cultural norms as the dominant public myth of American civilization, is today the only possible vehicle for effective resistance to managerial globalism and the national and cultural extinction it threatens. Once again, the lower middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, were identified as the natural base of the radical right, those who would throw off the shackles of the corporate, financial, and internationalist elite above them, while crushing the working class and poor below them. They were the real American nation, the heart in the heartland, who believed in preserving traditional hierarchies of class, race, gender, and sexuality, locked in a struggle with the decadent liberal and leftist elites of the cities and on the coast, and with the shadowy globalist cabals, and with the urban and non-white proletariat. They would defeat these elements and carry out a national rejuvenation. They would make America great again. And that greatness was not defined as, say, the 1950s, the time of the post-war prosperity, but a far earlier time, if one could even say that America has ever fully resembled the vision of the radical right. That greatness was to be found in an idealized, mythological version of America before the drastic progressive changes of the 20th century, before the Civil Rights Movement, before the New Deal, before first-wave feminism. As Murray Rothbard said in the same speech to the John Randolph Club, "If we know what the old right was against, what were they for? In general terms, they were for a restoration of the liberty of the old republic, of a government strictly limited to the defense of the rights of private property. In the concrete, as in the case of any broad coalition, there were differences of opinion within this overall framework. But we can boil down those differences to this question. How much of existing government would you repeal? How far would you roll government back? The minimum demand which almost all old rightists agreed on, which virtually defined the old right, was a total abolition of the New Deal, the whole kit and caboodle of the welfare state, the Wagner Act, the Social Security Act, going off gold in 1933, and all the rest. Others would press on to abolition of Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, including the Federal Reserve System, and especially that mighty instrument of tyranny, the income tax and the Internal Revenue Service. Still others, extremists such as myself, would not stop until we repealed the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789, and maybe even think the unthinkable and restore the good old Articles of Confederation. In the 19th century, American capitalism existed with little restraints. The period from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the early 20th century is often known as the Gilded Age, a time of unfettered free market capitalism, where rapacious robber barons amassed fantastic wealth and ruthlessly exploited workers. A time of little to no government regulations on business, no welfare state to speak of, and few labor unions. There was no income tax, no social security, no national relations, labor board. The role of the federal government was limited to protecting property, maintaining tariffs to protect a young American industry from European competition, and waging wars of imperial and colonial conquest. On the cultural side, women couldn't vote. Black Americans were subjected to massive, open discrimination and violence, especially, but by no means exclusively, in the Jim Crow South. Chinese immigrant laborers on the West Coast also suffered intense discrimination and violence. White supremacist ideas, rather than being on the retreat, were finding revitalization and gaining strength. Revisionist histories of the Civil War cast the South in a sympathetic light, and romanticized the enslaving South as a harmonious, civilized society which fought for its liberty against Northern tyranny. The Reconstruction period, where Black Americans were briefly afforded equal political and civil rights, was widely seen as a shameful blight on American history. These revisionist histories gained prominence and widespread acceptance, and the Ku Klux Klan, defunct for decades, came soaring back, attaining millions of members. The 1915 film A Birth of a Nation, which celebrated the Confederacy and the Ku Klux Klan, was a smashing success. America was proudly an ultra-capitalistic white man's nation, where the working class, the poor, women, and ethnic and racial minorities were crushed under the boot. But during this period, there were also those who saw this state of affairs and became deeply concerned for the sustainability of the system. These Americans were, in the main, educated professionals, members of the liberal intelligentsia, who saw the stratospheric inequality of the Gilded Age, the poverty and exploitation, and came to recognize that it couldn't last. Violent labor action was becoming increasingly commonplace, as workers resisted the exploitation of employers. And in America and Europe, the socialist movement gained increasing prominence, calling for an end to capitalism and a new system of socialized production and property. As time went on, the American economy became increasingly dominated by a smaller and smaller group of industrial megacorporations, which monopolized wealth, jacked up prices, and exerted extensive political influence. Liberal reformers were highly alarmed at the situation. They recognized that without reforms to ensure a basic, decent standard of living for the masses and curb the power of the industrial robber barons, the whole system would come crashing down. A fear later made particularly visceral by massive episodes of violent labor unrest and the Bolshevik Revolution abroad in Russia in 1917, which struck profound fear and horror into the upper classes of American society. The liberal reformers were no less horrified. They did not want to see capitalism abolished. They feared socialism and the specter of a social revolution. To prevent it, they coalesced into the Progressive Movement, beginning in the late 1890s, and sought to reform American capitalism. The Progressives pushed for labor regulations, anti-monopoly laws, business and financial regulations, the improvement of education, women's suffrage, and other initiatives to combat poverty, exploitation, and social dissolution. They pushed for a larger government, which much more extensively intervened in the country's economic and social affairs, to ensure the common well-being. The movement ultimately culminated in the New Deal of the 1930s, enacted amidst the depths of the Great Depression, which saw the creation of the welfare state, robust protections for labor, and the formation of a new compact between labor and capital, where labor would receive a greater share of the fruits of economic growth, while at the same time, the capitalist system would be preserved. American liberalism continued its string of reform up to the 1960s, ending with the victories of the Civil Rights Movement and the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson, the last major permanent expansions to the American welfare state. These were the foundations of the so-called managerial regime, which Samuel Francis denounced. These changes to American society, these reformations which moved the country away from the laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century and fought against traditional hierarchies of race and gender by giving more rights to non-whites and women, all of these changes were condemned as illegitimate by the paleoconservatives, who vowed to rewind them all, to turn the clock back completely. The liberal and leftist intelligentsia who spearheaded these changes, the managerial elite, were condemned for their alterations to what the paleocons viewed as the natural economic and social order. The foreign policy, too, of the managerial regime was condemned. The paleocons believed America never should have fought against the Axis powers in World War II, and never should have sought to build a liberal international order based, at least on paper, on human rights and democracy. And the paleoconservatives were endlessly frustrated with the conservative establishment of the Republican Party, which made peace to a large degree with liberalism, which did not seek to completely roll the clock back, which did not seek to repeal the 20th century. The paleoconservatives were calling for an end to compromise, an end to moderation, for a radical bourgeois politics which sought to totally vanquish the liberal and leftist intelligentsia, the so-called managerial elite, and seize complete power. For decades, however, the radical right was consigned to the fringes. The system of liberal democratic capitalism boomed and lifted all boats in the post-war economic expansion. And so the legitimacy of the system was too robust for any significant challenge, either from the right or the left. This, however, would soon begin to change. In 1973, the post-war economic boom, the golden age of American capitalism, which witnessed rapid growth, broad prosperity, and unprecedented improvement in the general quality of life, came to an abrupt end. The American economy slipped into a deep recession, and the recession marked the beginning of a decade-long period of major inflation despite high unemployment and weak productivity, a situation labeled stagflation, something previously thought to be impossible. Amidst this crisis, there was broad agreement that the economic model of the country was spent. The Keynesian consensus of the post-war years held that a mixed economy characterized by government intervention to promote investment and prop up consumer demand through full employment and raising real wages would be impervious to the economic instabilities which had previously plagued capitalism. But now that consensus had been proved flatly wrong, and something had to change. America had become the world's manufacturing powerhouse in the post-war years. But now the manufacturing sector was sharply contracting and struggling to stay above water. At the core of this crisis was something I've talked about in previous videos: the decline in the rate of profit. Western capitalist economies ran yet again into the problem which had fueled earlier economic crises: the tendency of the falling profit rate, of the limits of capital accumulation as fixed investment costs increasingly push down the rate of profit. This is a tendency Karl Marx described long ago. Capitalist boom periods are inevitably followed by slumps, as the accumulation of the capital stock, which cannot produce economic value in the way human workers can, raises costs and drags down the rate of profit. The post-war mixed economy provided much broader prosperity and social well-being than the earlier laissez-faire capitalism of the Gilded Age, but could not escape the inevitability of a profitability decline. The resulting economic crisis led to the casting aside of Keynesianism and the rollback of the mixed economy, and an increasing shift toward a new economic model designed to restore profitability: neoliberalism. Beginning with Jimmy Carter's presidency, labor and business regulations began to be rolled back, marking the beginning of a fundamental transition. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won the presidency and ushered in the Reagan Revolution, and the laissez-faire economics of before the 1930s was resurgent. The vigorous real wage growth enjoyed by American workers since the early 20th century came to an end, with real wages and productivity diverging sharply. Labor unions entered precipitous decline. Campaign finance laws were loosened or ceased to be enforced, effectively legalizing bribery and increasing the influence of wealthy donors in the political system. And antitrust laws ceased to be enforced, ensuring the eventual return of massive corporate monopolies, gobbling up small business, and exerting tremendous political influence. By the early 1990s, although neoliberal measures had done much to restore profitability, the sharp recession of 1990 to 1991 and the sluggish recovery afterwards fanned the flames of crisis again, and created enormous, broad discontent. Pat Buchanan and David Duke emerged as national political figures who appealed to the struggling lower middle classes. Economic precarity and instability drove many of the petty bourgeoisie, the quote-unquote middle Americans, toward the populist far right. In a similar fashion, though on a smaller scale, as how lower middle-class Germans were drawn to the Nazis in the depths of the Great Depression. Ultimately, the recession would pass and the economy would pick up steam again. After 1993, the US entered an economic expansion which would peak at the turn of the millennium. The populist far-right radicals who briefly emerged in the early 90s again faded into obscurity. The rest of the 1990s in America was a period of robust economic expansion and social and technological optimism. The Cold War was over and the Soviet Union was dead, and Western liberal capitalism was triumphant. The economy boomed and wages recovered some ground after declining in the prior 2 decades. The rise of the internet signaled the beginning of the information age, and with it a so-called new economy powered by the burgeoning tech companies springing from Silicon Valley. The neoliberal model for a time appeared to be working. The old New Deal order, with its guarantees of labor rights and social welfare, and based in large degree on the manufacturing sector, was cast aside for the shiny new neoliberal order. The economy of the future was one without unions, with less welfare and more personal responsibility, quote-unquote, and increasingly dominated by the tech sector as companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon grew tremendously. Profits soared, GDP grew healthily, and unemployment was low. The future looked prosperous and bright. It seemed the US had solved the deep economic woes which set in during the 1970s. Then, however, came a hiccup. In 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. And from 2000 to 2002, a recession set in throughout the developed world. The US experienced a recession in 2001, and while it wasn't particularly severe, it was also not an especially encouraging sign for the neoliberal order which was supposed to solve the country's economic woes and usher in a prosperous, technologically marvelous future. But for now, the economy recovered quickly and the gravy train kept on moving. The economy continued growing after 2001 until late 2007. The housing market, which had boomed in the preceding years, suddenly collapsed, and the crash reverberated, sending the developed capitalist economies into what became known as the Great Recession. It was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, a disaster completely unforeseen by economists and policymakers, and which greatly undermined public confidence in the status quo. In the US, the country turned to Barack Obama, a charismatic upstart who promised hope and change. Something had gone wrong, and terribly wrong. The good times were over. The neoliberal model had entirely failed to live up to its promises. America descended into a new Gilded Age, where the rich became richer and the poor poorer, where new robber barons emerged and followed in the footsteps of their predecessors, exploiting and bleeding society dry with no compunction and no recognition of moral and ethical restraint. The ideal of the mass middle-class society became nothing more than a memory. The American dream nothing more than a dream. Mass prosperity turned into mass immiseration, atomization, and profound social decline. Opioids ravaged communities and killed hundreds of thousands. Social mistrust and isolation became endemic to American life, and community life withered away as people became increasingly insular and addicted to screens. Faith in the system dissipated, and discontent, anger, and cynicism took its place. All the while, American elites cared nothing for addressing the pathologies which were sending the country down a very dark and dangerous path. The political and social order was growing ripe for destabilization, and inevitably, the radical populist New Right stepped out of the shadows. When Trump announced his presidential campaign on June 16, 2015, he was overwhelmingly considered a joke, a clown, a frivolous non-entity, whose entry into the race would make for entertainment and amusement, while Republican primary voters inevitably chose a serious candidate like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio. It was widely believed that the 2016 election would inevitably come down to a contest between Jeb Bush, the brother of George W. Bush, and another son of George H.W. Bush, and Hillary Clinton, husband to Bill Clinton, in the ultimate establishmentarian contest. A race between two political dynasties which would have some of the lowest stakes imaginable. And as Trump made outlandish statement after outlandish statement, espousing virulent racism and xenophobia and populist nationalism as he decried the political establishment, the consensus was only cemented among the political and media class that he had no chance of winning. But it wasn't very long before these predictions were confounded. Trump began climbing in the polls, and every piece of controversy seemed to boost, not diminish, Trump's position among Republican voters. During Obama's presidency, the first signs of a new populist far-right energy in the Republican Party had manifested in the Tea Party movement, as incensed Republicans organized protests and expressed a deep dissatisfaction with the existing party establishment. But the Tea Party movement had been successfully tamed and co-opted by the party establishment and by wealthy GOP donors who funded the movement. The popular energy was turned toward the narrow ends of lowering taxes and cutting government programs, rather than any kind of a significant transformation of the party and its priorities. But now Trump was building a new movement, Make America Great Again, which was making appeals to the deepest passions and aspirations of the Republican base, unapologetically trumpeting racism, misogyny, and cruelty, as well as fury at the Washington establishment and a vow to drain the swamp. Trump's campaign was fulfilling the vision which new right ideologues like Murray Rothbard and Samuel Francis had laid out decades before, and which Pat Buchanan had implemented, but only to limited effect. His campaign was appealing to the middle American radicals, the lower middle-class core of the Republican Party, whose desires and interests had been subordinated to a neoconservative establishment which had long harnessed but officially disavowed bigotry and extremism. And this base was far angrier than it had been in 1992, allowing Trump to accomplish what Buchanan had not come even close to achieving. In 1992, the economy was in the gutter, and discontent was widespread, but the fundamentals of the political and socio-economic order were still not widely questioned. Now in 2016, after 20 years of systemic failure and corruption, the discontent with the existing order was far more widespread, and the Republican base was far more open to the appeals of radical nationalist populism. Defying all conventional wisdom, Trump cruised to victory in the primaries, winning 45% of the national vote and 41 out of 56 contests. With Trump as the Republican nominee, the conventional wisdom shifted to a new line, that Trump had no chance of defeating Hillary Clinton in the general election. His bigotry and repulsiveness would surely turn off too many voters to make the race competitive. and the Democrats were heading for a historic landslide. And polls seemed to validate this, showing Hillary Clinton with enormous double-digit leads. But Trump and his campaign were savvy. They knew that the same rhetoric and venom they had used to win the primary could not win the general election. They had to win a broader coalition than the lower middle class. In particular, they had to win working class voters. And this could only be done by speaking to working class grievances. And they pursued this deftly. On the campaign trail, Trump promised to be the president of the forgotten working man, and vowed to bring back the highly paid manufacturing jobs, which had been the bedrock of working class prosperity in the 20th century. He condemned a decrepit establishment, which had left ordinary Americans behind and left their communities to rot. He called out Hillary Clinton's corruption and how she and the vast majority of American politicians were beholden to wealthy donors rather than to their voters. He also cynically condemned senseless wars, portraying himself as a peace candidate who would focus on investing in America rather than pursuing bloody imperialist adventures abroad. The strategy was highly effective. His gains were limited for now among white working-class voters, but they were enough to pull off the greatest upset in American political history, defeating Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College even though he lost the popular vote by 2 points. Trump's first victory triggered a tremendous backlash from American institutions and a massive protest movement. Trump was still a pariah, a black sheep among the American ruling class. His MAGA movement was still very small, and thus mostly ineffective, and hard-line MAGA ideologues he brought into his administration like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller were dramatically outnumbered by the conventional establishment conservatives who Trump was forced to fill his White House with for lack of any other personnel. Trump winning in 2016 was something which wasn't really supposed to happen, and indeed if America didn't have the highly anachronistic electoral college from the 18th century, he wouldn't have won, though his ability to come so close still would have sent shockwaves. As such, Trump was highly constrained. Trump came to power, but the MAGA movement did not, because the MAGA movement was still in its infancy and lacked organization and personnel. Trump's victory triggered an upswell of far-right jubilance, leading to the rise of the alt-right, which the American media became obsessed with in 2017. But the alt-right was tiny, and after the fiasco which was the Charlottesville rally, collapsed and receded from the limelight. So despite the intense opposition to Trump and fears of fascism, Trump ended up governing not too differently than any other Republican president would have in the late 2010s. He couldn't pursue the radical ambitions of the MAGA movement, and so the system chugged along. It was not yet the time of crisis. That would not be until 2020. As COVID-19 emerged and sent the world into lockdown, governments around the world saw massive surges in popular support in a rally around the flag effect. But Trump did not enjoy this. Americans broadly disapproved of his handling of the pandemic, with his downplaying of the severity of the outbreak, his peddling of unproven medications, his attempt to incite racism against Chinese people. The pandemic destabilized the country, producing the largest wave of protests and urban riots since the 1960s, triggered by outrage over George Floyd's murder by police, and crime rates surged amidst a sharp recession as the economy was held together by massive federal bailouts. Despite the turmoil, however, Trump had the benefit of running against Biden, a deeply establishmentarian politician, and combined with the intense opposition from American institutions, Trump was still able to claim the mantle of a populist outsider. He not only held on to, but expanded his working class gains from 2016, making stunning inroads with non-white working class voters, especially Latinos. Biden and the Democrats would ultimately win, but it would be a much narrower victory than polls projected, and it would be off the backs of inroads with white college-educated voters, rather than winning back working-class voters the Democrats lost in 2016. Nevertheless, Trump had lost the presidency, and rather than conceding defeat, he decided to fight to cling to power, in an unprecedented attempt to subvert the American system of government. He screeched about voter fraud and said the election was rigged. He refused, and has still refused to this day, to recognize the legitimacy of the results. And from November 2020 to January 2021, he and his circle of MAGA diehard advisors brainstormed schemes to remain in power. They tried to create fake election certificates and sought to pressure Vice President Mike Pence, who would oversee the Electoral College certification, to accept the fake certificates. General Mike Flynn, who had served as a national security advisor to Trump, urged Trump to declare martial law, suspend the Constitution, and run new elections under military rule. But Trump and his allies were outmatched, and lacked the support of most of the Republican establishment. The effort to overturn the election culminated in the violence of January 6th, which predictably failed to overturn the election, and Trump was sent packing. With the Democrats back in power, here was another chance to address the popular discontent which had ushered Trump into office in 2016 and made 2020 unreasonably close. The core base of the MAGA movement, the lower middle class and middle American radicals, were never going to be winnable for Democrats. But the working class voters who were swayed by Trump's vows to bring back jobs and dismantle the corrupt Washington establishment were a different story. They had previously voted for Democrats and had voted for Barack Obama by large margins, but they grew to loathe the establishment and its refusal to deliver for them, and so were peeled away by Trump. If the incoming Biden administration and Democratic majority in Congress could restore this trust, then it would be essentially impossible for Trump or any other representative of the MAGA movement to win again in 2024. Fortunately for Trump and the MAGA movement, the Democrats did not do this. Instead, the Biden years were a disaster. As inflation soared and the cost of living went from bad to utterly unbearable, the Biden administration and the Democratic establishment did little to address working class grievances. The latest cast of rotating villains and Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema were cited as the reasons why Democrats couldn't pass basic beneficial policies like raising the minimum wage. The public option for healthcare, which Biden promised, vanished as soon as he won. He just never talked about it again. The major expansions to the social safety net made during COVID were entirely rolled back, with little fanfare or debate in Washington. Liberals denied the existence of a cost of living crisis and widespread economic discontent among Americans, and claimed that the country was in a golden age of prosperity. Even the political left was nowhere to really be seen fighting against the neoliberal establishment of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Socialist wing of the party, represented in Bernie Sanders and AOC, made its peace, backed Biden, and ceased running much in the way of primary challenges to centrist Democrats. Meanwhile, the Biden administration pursued a deeply unpopular, jingoistic foreign policy up to the annihilation of Gaza. The door was wide open to a return of Trump and the ascendancy of the MAGA movement in 2024. The MAGA movement was the only oppositional force to the highly unpopular status quo. And in the 2024 election, Trump promised to lower prices, end the wars, crack down on violent crime, and restore American prosperity. Enough of voters decided to give it a chance. And Trump not only won the Electoral College, but also the popular vote. And now the MAGA movement was far more organized and powerful. The right-wing legal movement put forward the idea of unitary executive theory, a fancy way of saying that a right-wing president should get to be a dictator who doesn't have to listen to Congress or really anyone. Far-right pontificators like Curtis Yarvin and Costin Alamario, who openly believe in and advocate for right-wing dictatorship, are major intellectual influences on the present administration. And the conduct of the second Trump administration, with its savagery, its flagrant disregard of constitutional laws and norms, its vast expansion of a repressive apparatus to violently brutalize undesirables and go after the administration's political enemies, is all consistent with the objective of transforming the country into a fascist regime. And furthermore, since 2024, this effort has been boosted by a new group of immensely powerful allies, the tech oligarchs. Today, it can be hard to remember that it wasn't very long ago when Silicon Valley was coded as liberal even progressive. Silicon Valley had a close relationship with the Democratic Party for a long time, beginning in the 1980s, with the rising neoliberal faction of the party, which was for a time labeled as the Atari Democrats, who trumpeted Silicon Valley and the tech sector as the future of the American economy, as the creators of a so-called new economy, which would replace the old, obsolete economic model of New Deal industrial capitalism, which descended into crisis in the 1970s. Democratic presidential candidate Gary Hart was the first major face of this faction, running as a fresh face with fresh ideas against the old New Deal establishment, and coming very close to winning the 1984 Democratic nomination. 8 years later, Bill Clinton brought the Atari Democrats to the White House, and made investing in the tech sector to foster the new economy a top priority. As Silicon Valley boomed and gave birth to the new titans of Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, PayPal, etc., the industry was broadly aligned with the Democratic Party. The neoliberal faction, which had captured the Democratic Party, placed their faith in Silicon Valley to deliver prosperity and progress, and so believed Silicon Valley should be granted anything and everything it wanted, with Bill Clinton showering Silicon Valley with billions of dollars and cementing a near-total lack of regulations. This was the path to the future, according to neoliberals. The tech capitalists would soon become the wealthiest section of American capitalists, their companies becoming gigantic monopolistic behemoths, which would have run entirely afoul of antitrust regulations in the mid-20th century, whether through unleashing social media on the world, swindling investors with techno-nonsense, or now peddling AI slop. In the first Trump administration, the tech capitalists generally kept their distance from Trump. They had a long working affinity with the Democrats. Their entire industry, in fact, owed itself to public research and investment, which Democrats had pushed the most ardently. And so they were at least nominally anti-Trump and dutifully banned neo-Nazis, pandemic misinformation, and Trump himself for a brief time after he tried to overthrow the government. However, then something shocking happened. As it turns out, ultra-rich capitalists who amass astronomical fortunes through exploitation and parasitism will tend to gravitate to right-wing politics. This stunning, unforeseeable development took hold during the Biden administration, when Biden's decision to throw a bone to the left-wing flank of the party by tapping Lina Khan, an antitrust firebrand, to the FCC, caused Silicon Valley to have a conniption. Furthermore, there was a surge of union organizing efforts in the tech sector. There were anti-racist and feminist campaigns like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. All of this combined to make Silicon Valley profoundly discontent with the Democrats and shift to the right, very far to the right. Jeff Bezos, who had purchased the Washington Post back in 2013, now began intervening to turn it into a right-wing rag, and prevented the editorial board from endorsing Kamala Harris in 2024. Mark Andreessen began whining and complaining about how the left's hatred of white people and giga IQ tech entrepreneurs like himself forced him to become a Nazi. Peter Thiel has emerged as the Antichrist, with his company Palantir working hand-in-hand with the Trump regime to build a mass surveillance state. Elon Musk turned Twitter into a den of Nazism and cryptocurrency shells. Sieg Heiled on stage and joined Trump's administration, and through Doge decimated government services and cut off American humanitarian aid to poor countries, leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people already, including many, many children. It has long been noted by many scholars and intellectuals that there is historically a connection between corporate monopolies and fascist movements and regimes. This has long been debated and disputed for decades, but I think the current experience of America should put to rest these debates. The rise of ultra-rich oligarchs controlling massive monopolistic corporations breeds fascism, because these oligarchs are inevitably attracted to extreme right-wing movements, which promise to radically assert and cement their power. Fascist movements are built from a lower middle-class mass base. That's how they originate, but they come to power by forging an alliance with ultra-rich oligarchs. Fascism is an alliance of monopoly capital with the lower middle class, aka the petty bourgeoisie, and this pattern is playing out again. This was actually a major justification behind both American and European antitrust law. Even before World War II in 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt was describing fascism as, quote, the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. The idea that there was a link between German monopolies and the rise of the Nazis was widespread, and even endorsed by the US occupation authorities in Germany. The 1950 Seller-Kefauver Act, which significantly strengthened existing antitrust law, was motivated in large part by anti-fascism. It was conventional wisdom. Post-war social democracy understood that excessive concentration of the economy risked undermining the liberal state and ushering in fascism. Antitrust enforcement was one of the pillars of the post-war order, which neoliberalism attacked. American politicians and judges increasingly believed neoliberal theorists who said that the concentration of wealth and capital was no big deal, and in fact it benefited everyone because of the improved efficiency and innovation of mega corporations. And as such, the American economy today has become highly concentrated. This is what brings a fascist movement to maturation. Petty bourgeois radicals linking up with the corporate oligarchy. I don't think I need to explain to most of you watching that if the fascist movement is successful in seizing and consolidating power in America, it will lead to cataclysm on a scale we cannot comprehend. But I just want to emphasize it. The last time a fascist rose to power in major industrialized countries, it led to 70 to 85 million deaths. There are many who downplay the danger, both liberals and leftists. I will concede that I was one of them before this year. It can be difficult to reckon with what we are facing, and tempting to think that our situation can't be that dire. Humans have a strong tendency toward a normalcy bias. We often underrate the potential for catastrophe. Just think about where we are. The Trump administration has been pursuing the new right goal of repealing the 20th century. It has been subjecting immigrants to unspeakable brutality and cruelty, deporting them without due process and against court orders to foreign concentration camps where they have been subjected to inhuman torture and assault, and building concentration camps right here at home, where the sadistic torture once confined to US military installations like Guantanamo Bay has come to our soil, inflicted upon entirely innocent immigrants who have committed no crimes. And lest you think, well, this is all really horrible and unfortunate, but that's confined to non-naturalized immigrants, and thus citizens that don't have to worry. The Trump regime has made it very clear that they want to do this to US citizens too, even US-born citizens.
We also have homegrown criminals. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country, but you'll have to be looking at the laws on that.
They're only doing it to immigrants for now because that's way easier to get away with. But their aspiration, which they are working toward, is putting citizens in camps like this as well who are deemed undesirable or who criticize and oppose this regime. The far right, it should always be remembered, is a minority of the country. Trump's approval rating has absolutely plummeted since the start of the year, and particularly among working-class voters, who gravitated to him in 2016, 2020, and 2024. They have mostly jumped ship, realizing they were conned. Those Americans who are truly and totally loyal to the MAGA movement. They are perhaps 30 to 35% of the population. But that's roughly similar to the maximum vote share the Nazis achieved in a free election. Fascist regimes don't need and usually don't have a majority support when they seize and consolidate power. You don't need a majority to rule a country, if you can successfully overcome your opposition, which is what happened in Germany, Italy, and other fascist and semi-fascist regimes. The far right is now a powerful force in America. The recent setbacks experienced by the Trump administration shouldn't make us complacent, especially when we have a corrupt, pathetic opposition party in the Democrats. And don't forget the rising influence of Nick Fuentes, an open neo-Nazi and a veteran of the original alt-right, whose influence has been growing by leaps and bounds within the past year, being platformed for a nice, friendly chat with Tucker Carlson, which was subsequently defended by a board member of the Heritage Foundation. who said that a figure like Fuentes should be welcomed into the Republican coalition. This board member did face consequences and was forced to resign, but how much longer will there be any consequences? The younger generations of Republicans, most Republicans below the age of 45, are at this point neo-Nazis. Given the attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election when losing to Joe Biden, an elderly centrist Democrat, what do you think they're going to do upon losing in 2028, especially if it's to a more left-wing Democrat? Why do you think the Trump administration is trying to take control of the voting systems, sending the National Guard to blue cities? Why do you think Trump issued NSPM 7, a national security directive ordering joint terrorism task forces to investigate all those espousing anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, and extremism on migration, race, and gender? These are the types of things you do when you have no intention of leaving. You don't build this kind of repressive apparatus and then just hand it over to the opposing political party. Why do you think Trump is renovating the White House into his own personal palace and building a gaudy, gilded ballroom? Do you think he intends a President AOC or a President Jon Stewart to ever have access to his precious ballroom? The fact is, this country is rapidly approaching a crisis, and people need to recognize the profound danger of the moment we are in. Things are never going back to the way they were before. Either we leap forward into a humane socialist future, or we have the Burger Reich.